Buckle up, everybody, because this deep dive is going to take us straight into the heart of ancient wisdom. We're talking about a text that some claim held more divine power than any other, the Asclepius.
Yeah, the Asclepius is it's kind of mystery wrapped in an enigma. It attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Now, that name might sound familiar to some listeners, but for those who don't know, it's actually the Greek name for the Egyptian god Thoth. And it's thought to have been written sometime between 100-300 AD. But get this, the beliefs it draws on are way, way older.
Right. It's like getting a peek into the minds of those who came before the ancient Egyptians. It makes you wonder what they knew that we've lost.
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating is how much of what we find in the Asclepius still echoes in modern thought. It's almost like a crash course in Hermetic philosophy. And that system of thought influenced early Christianity and thinkers all across history.
Okay, so let's unpack some of the core tenets of Hermetic philosophy. For someone who's never encountered these ideas, what's like the biggest aha moment they might have?
That's a good question. I think one of the biggest aha moments that someone might come across is this idea of the one and the all. And the way the Asclepius puts it is by saying all things are one and the one is all.
Mm-hmm.
And we could spend this entire deep dive unpacking just that one sentence.
And why is that?
Well, because on the surface it seems impossible. How can everything be separate and a single thing at the same time?
Right, it's a paradox.
Exactly. And yet, haven't you ever just had that feeling like you're out in nature or you connect with another person on a really deep level and you suddenly feel that interconnectedness? Well, the Asclepius is saying that this unity, it's not just a feeling, it's the fundamental truth of reality.
Whoa. Okay, so if everything is interconnected like that, then what does that make the universe itself?
Well, that's where the Asclepius introduces this really stunning concept. It's this idea of the cosmos as mirror. So it's not just a random collection of stuff, but a reflection of the divine.
So by studying the universe, we're actually studying God, or at least the nature of the divine.
Exactly. The Asclepius really pushes us to see beyond the physical world and recognize the spiritual essence that's woven into everything. But it doesn't stop there. It takes this idea even further and says, you as a human being are a microcosm. You are a mini version of this divine blueprint.
Hold on, so I'm not just admiring this cosmos as mirror, I am a mirror reflecting something larger than myself.
Precisely. The Asclepius says that you are the second image of God, containing both the divine spark and the stuff of the material world. You are that bridge between the spiritual and the physical, the link between heaven and earth.
So if I'm understanding this right, the Asclepius is saying that I'm not just some random being in some random universe. I have a purpose, maybe even a responsibility because of this unique position I hold.
Absolutely. And understanding that purpose requires a special kind of knowledge. It's not just about facts and figures, but what the text calls godlike concentration of consciousness.
And that's where this gets really practical, right? Because it's not enough to just passively listen to this deep dive. The Asclepius is saying we have to engage with these ideas almost like they're alive.
You hit the nail on the head. The Asclepius is saying that understanding the divine understanding ourselves takes active, engaged learning, the kind of learning most of us aren't used to. And that's where the real transformation begins.
Okay, I'm hooked. I definitely want to hear more about this transformation, this responsibility. But before we do, I'm curious, for those listening who might be familiar with other ancient texts, what makes the Asclepius stand out?
That's a great question. One thing that makes the Asclepius truly unique is how it weaves together these big cosmic ideas with a very specific view of humanity's place and purpose within this grand scheme of things.
And from what I've read, it doesn't shy away from the challenges we face as humans either. It sounds like the Asclepius doesn't just offer a rosy picture, but a real look at the choices we have and the potential consequences of those choices.
You're right. It definitely doesn't sugarcoat anything. In fact, the Asclepius describes a kind of crossroads for humanity. And it's a crossroads that we still find ourselves at today.
All right, so we're at a crossroads. What does the Asclepius say about the path forward for humanity? What choices are we facing and what's at stake?
Well, the text really emphasizes this idea that humans have this incredible capacity, for both greatness and destruction. And it really all goes back to this idea of our dual nature, this idea that we're made of both eternal spirit and this mortal matter.
Right, we touched on that earlier, this whole being a bridge between the divine and the material.
Exactly. And the Asclepius calls this the fortunate middle position. So we have the potential to connect with the divine while also engaging with the physical world.
I mean, that feels like a lot of pressure. Like we have to balance these two sides perfectly, or we risk falling apart.
It's not so much about perfect balance as it is about remembering our purpose. And the Asclepius is very clear that humans have a twofold, even a sacred duty.
Okay, hit me with it. What are our marching orders according to this ancient text?
First and foremost, we are meant to contemplate and reverence God, to cultivate a deep connection with the divine source of all things.
Basically, don't forget where you came from, right? Easier said than done in today's world.
You got that right. But it's essential because it leads to the second part of our duty, which is caring for the created world.
Okay, so it's not enough to just have your own spiritual house in order. You have to make sure the whole neighborhood is taken care of as well.
Exactly. The Asclepius says that these physical bodies that we have, they're not prisons for the soul, but they're tools to engage with this material world, to create, to cultivate, to build.
That's actually a really empowering way to look at it. It means that our physical existence isn't something to escape from, but it's a way to actively participate in the divine plan.
And that's where things get really interesting because the Asclepius doesn't shy away from the pitfalls of this whole duality thing. The text warns against what it calls the peril of possessions.
Let me guess. That's when we get so caught up in material wealth and status that we forget about our spiritual side.
Bingo. And it's not about rejecting the material world entirely, but it's about finding the right relationship with it. Because when we become enslaved by our desires, we lose sight of that divine spark that's within us.
Okay, so how do we avoid that trap? Because let's face it, that desire for stuff, it's pretty ingrained in us.
Well, the Asclepius offers an antidote, and
Yeah.
it's probably not what you might think. It's not about, renouncing all your possessions and living in a cave somewhere.
Okay, intriguing. I'm
Okay.
assuming it's not about accumulating more stuff either. So what is it? What's the secret weapon against this peril of possessions?
Knowledge, but not just any kind of knowledge.
Hmm.
The Asclepius emphasizes a very deep transformative understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos.
So it's like connecting the dots. We have to see how everything fits together and ultimately our role in the bigger picture.
Precisely. Because this kind of knowledge is what helps us see through the illusions of the material world and remember our true purpose.
That's fascinating, but it also feels a bit abstract. Does the Asclepius offer any concrete examples of what this downfall might look like? Any cautionary tales?
As a matter of fact, it does. The Asclepius actually contains a prophecy about the fate of Egypt that's incredibly relevant to what we're talking about.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. I love a good prophecy.
Well, this one's a doozy. The text describes a time when the gods withdraw from the earth. Foreigners invade Egypt, and they neglect its ancient religion and its spiritual practices. Temples are abandoned, the people lose their way, and this once thriving civilization crumbles.
And this actually happened, right? Ancient Egypt did eventually fall.
Exactly. Which makes the prophecy in the Asclepius even more chilling. Because it wasn't just about the downfall of one nation. It was a warning about what happens when humanity turns away from its sacred duty, when we prioritize these material pursuits over spiritual growth.
Okay, that's pretty intense. And it definitely feels relevant today. I mean, just think about it. We are constantly bombarded with messages telling us to buy more, achieve more, be more. It's easy to forget about the bigger picture when you're so caught up in the daily grind.
And that's exactly the danger that the Asclepius is warning us about. You see, this prophecy, it's not meant to scare us, it's meant to wake us up. It's a reminder that we have a choice to make. We can continue down this path of spiritual amnesia, or we can choose to reclaim our true purpose and create a different future.
So what's the alternative? I mean, if the Asclepius is all doom and gloom about the fate of humanity, why are we even bothering with this deep dive?
Because the text doesn't just offer warnings, it also offers hope. Just as it describes this cataclysmic cleansing, it also speaks of renewal and restoration.
Okay, so there's light at the end of the tunnel. Tell me more about this renewal. How do we get there?
Well, the Asclepius suggests that even in the darkest of times, there's always the possibility of redemption, of starting anew. It might not be easy, but it's possible to find our way back to that state of grace, to that connection with the divine that we were meant to embody.
And how do we do that? What's the first step?
It goes back to knowledge, to that deep understanding of our true selves and our connection to the divine.
So it's not just about knowing the right information. It's about embodying it, living it.
Exactly. It's about aligning our actions with our highest aspirations, with that divine spark that's within each of us.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? How do we bridge this gap between this ancient wisdom and our modern lives? That's where things get really interesting because the Asclepius introduces this whole other concept of humans as creators, beings with the power to shape reality itself.
Ah, yes. This is where we get into the really juicy stuff. This idea that we're not just these passive players in the grand cosmic drama, but we're active participants with the ability to shape our destinies in the world around us.
All right, you've piqued my curiosity. Let's dive into this whole idea of humans as creators. What does the Asclepius have to say about our creative potential, and how does it connect to everything else we've been discussing?
Okay, so where we left off was this whole idea of humans as creators with the power to shape reality itself. It's a pretty bold claim, even for a text as ancient as the Asclepius. So how literally are we supposed to take this? Are we talking about like building pyramids with our minds?
Well, not quite, although the ancient Egyptians might disagree with you on that.
Good point.
Yeah. The Asclepius actually uses this really intriguing phrase. It calls what humans can create terrestrial gods.
Terrestrial gods. Okay, so not the god, but gods with a small g.
Exactly. And it's really important to remember the context here. The Asclepius was written at a time when these traditional polytheistic beliefs were really being challenged by the rise of Christianity.
So talking about creating gods, even terrestrial ones, would have been a pretty radical idea. Absolutely. It would have ruffled some feathers, to say the least. But the Asclepius isn't suggesting that we're like replacing the supreme god, or that we're becoming deities ourselves.
So how do these terrestrial gods fit into the picture then?
Well, think of them more like intermediaries, like conduits of divine power that humans can tap into. And we do this through our actions, our thoughts, our intentions.
So it's less about creating something totally new and more about like channeling something that's already there.
Exactly. The Asclepius even suggests that these terrestrial gods, because they are created with both divine and human elements, are more accessible to us. They're more attuned to our needs and desires.
So is it like having a direct line to the divine, but for more like everyday concerns?
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
The text actually gives examples of how these gods can be invoked for healing, for guidance, even for protection.
That's interesting. It's starting to sound like a form of magic, but one that requires a very deep respect for the divine.
That's a great observation. And, the Asclepius is really walking a fine line here. It's acknowledging the power of human agency. But at the same time, it's still emphasizing reverence and respect for that ultimate source of power.
It's a lot to take in, I have to admit, but I think it's starting to click for me. We're not just talking about creating external gods in a literal sense, but we're talking about cultivating those divine qualities, cultivating them within ourselves and in the world around us.
Precisely. Because it's about recognizing that our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs, they all have this ripple effect. And they're shaping not only our own reality, but the reality that we collectively share.
So if we're constantly creating these terrestrial gods, what kind of gods are we creating today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one the Asclepius really leaves us to ponder. If we look around at the world today, we look at the state of our planet, we look at the relationships between individuals and nations, what does it tell us about the kinds of gods that we are currently bringing into being?
It's a challenging question, but it's also an incredibly empowering one. Because it means we have the power to change course. We can make different choices. Ultimately, we can create a different kind of reality.
And that's really the ultimate message of the Asclepius.
Mm-hmm.
It's a call to remember our divine origins. It's a call to cultivate our own inner wisdom. And it's a call to use our knowledge and understanding to create a world that reflects the beauty and harmony of the cosmos.
It's a powerful message, and it's one that honestly feels just as relevant today as it did centuries ago. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Asclepius, I want to leave you with this. If you were to create a terrestrial god to guide humanity into the future, what qualities would it embody? What kind of world would it help us to create? Think about that and maybe even let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.